Can you guys all see my screen?
Yes, no problem.
All right. Okay, let me get started. First of all, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Paipo. I'm right now working as a front-end engineer in Mercari in Japan. And I'm also a co-founder of this meetup, WebHack Meetup. And in the company, I mainly work with Typescript. And I haven't got a chance to work with Elm to develop internal tools in the company as well. So that's why today I'd like to talk about how to transplant some good paradigms from Elm in your garden. And by your garden, it means the language you are using at daily work. So as an example, let's create a food delivery service. It's a screenshot from Uber Eats. And in order to create this kind of page, you definitely need an API, right? And this is the sample API I also got from Uber Eats. First of all, it's a list of stores with a UID, a string, and have a title, rating, and an image. For image, it's more complex than other fields, which contains item properties, which is a list of URL objects. And in order to implement that page, you probably need the component like this. Please don't put too much emphasis on the syntax itself. It's written in React, but the most important part is the concept itself. First of all, you probably need a state to hold a list of stores. And that's why I defined a state, a storage state. And then you need to fetch some API in order to get the data of a list of stores. And after that, you will set these stores inside your state, and you can do the rendering after that. So it's pretty simple, right? After you implement these kind of components, probably you can get a page like this. It's a list of stores showing on the Uber Eats. And it's not enough. Probably a good website not only have the happy path, you also need to handle things like loading status. How will you handle that? It's actually quite easy. You can just add another state, which is called loading status. And by using this state, you can, before you fetching the API, you set the loading to true. And if you fetch successfully, you can set the loading status back to false. And if the loading flag is true, you can render loading components. And if it's false, you can render a list of stores. Pretty easy, right? And after that, you can start seeing this kind of transition screen. If you refresh the page, you will first see the loading status, and then you can see a list of stores. But as a professional, we can not only handle the loading state and a list of stores, we also need to handle the error status. And probably most of you will think, this is an example, like sometimes we will receive the API response, which contains 500 status code with error message as a payload body. And you can just add another state. It's called error state. And with this error state, because fetch is a promise. So once something goes wrong, you can add another catch block to catch this error object, and you can set it in the store and render the UI accordingly. However, after you do so, you refresh the page, and if the API return 500, you will start receiving this kind of errors. Does this sound familiar with all of you? I think for front engineers, it's our daily, right? And what's going wrong? So the reason is because for a fetch promise, even if the return status code is not 200, it will still be resolved. For example, if it's 500, it will still resolve. It won't jump to the catch block. So that's why it cannot be caught by your catch block, and the error status won't contain the error object. And that's why you have the previous error. How can you fix it? You can first check if the response that OK is true. If it's true, you can continue your promise. If it's not, you can throw another error. And then after that, you can this error can be caught by your catch block. However, it's not over yet. You still have another issues. Does any of you know what's going wrong? If you can check this code again, like anything goes wrong. Okay, I'll let you know. So after you go to the page again and you refresh the page, now you will receive a page handing on at the loading status. And to debug, you can check the the dev tool and seeing now there a Boolean state, which the current value is true. And this is actually the loading state. And it also at the same time has another arrow state, which contains something wrong as a string. So basically it's an impossible state. What does it mean by at the same time you have a loading status as true and also have an arrow state as some string? But your program cannot reason about it, right? And the root cause of this is because you forget to set the loading status back to false. And I believe it happened to like many of us, like when we develop these kind of features and there are so many states floating around and it's easy to make mistakes, right? And not only for the previous example I just shown, it actually, if you have 3 states like store, loading, and arrow, in total, probably you had at least 8 different states. And over the half of these states are impossible. By impossible states, I mean, for example, what does it mean by if there is a list of stores and the loading is true and you have an error message saying something wrong? It doesn't make sense, right? Because you don't know if right now it's in the loading status or it's in the error status or it's a successful status. And even worse, I'm already using TypeScript. I define the proper types of my application, but the compiler doesn't tell me all those traps. I can still make mistakes. And this is the screenshot from the TypeScript website. It says it's the result you can trust. And I trust TypeScript, and that's why I use it. But still, the compiler doesn't help me that much. At this moment, probably some of your like colleagues or your like TypeScript expert friends will come to you saying, you haven't used any advanced type techniques. If you use them, probably it will make things easier and make the compiler smarter as well. How about start with some union types? So when we think about it, now we have loading status, arrow status, and a list of stores. And these different states actually correlate with each other. It means only one state can be happen at the same time. It cannot be happen at the given point of time. So if it's happening, it means it's an impossible state. So that's why we can make use of union types techniques here. And by defining the loading state, which only have a loading as true, and fail state, which has error as a string, and also the success state, which contains a list of stores. And you can do a union types to make a store state. Sounds pretty good. We can do some refactoring here. Right now, we only have one single store state. And before we fetching the API, we can set the store state to loading as true. And if you fetch successfully, you will get the list of stored data. And then you can set the store state into a list of store into your store state. And if something goes south, you can catch the error and set the error messages. However, after I use these techniques, in the dev tool, I can definitely see these 3 different states, like the loading state, success state, and failure state. And based on which moment you are in, you can check these state correspondingly. But when I experiment a bit more, here is the place where I initialize my state. And I try to provide an impossible state, which is an empty array, and loading is true, and arrow has a string. At this moment, the compiler still compiles, doesn't tell me something goes wrong, but this is actually an impossible state. And the other issues is after I structure my code using the fetch store state, now if originally I check the arrow property to see if it exists. If it exists, I will render arrow components. But now the compiler complains saying the property arrow doesn't exist on type fetch store state. Even if I already use union types and one of the possible type is it contains the arrow properties. And what's going wrong? So here I want to talk about like 2 common misunderstanding of using union type. First of all, is we normally treat type definition as its value. The meaning of this is, for example, we have a store loading state here, right? And the type definition is a loading property with a true as a value. And we will think the one on the right, which is the object has a loading as true, is the only possible value of the store loading state. However, it's not, this is being defined. It's like, for example, if you have a variable which the type is number, and the possible values is not only number itself, right? It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's like many possible values of this number type. And I think this is same as these object type as well. It's not only loading true is a valid type. You can also have loading true with some random key and value. And also you can have loading true with the arrow key and have another value. And same as a fail state. It actually, as long as your object contains these arrow property with a string value, and no matter how many other properties you have, it can be considered a possible values of this type. So that's the first misunderstanding when we use union types or see the type object type definition. And then the second misunderstanding is we try to map the pipe operator to OR operator directly. And it means by OR, we mean if you check the bottom of the store state, and when we see this, we will read it as the current store state. It can be either loading true or it can be arrow as failed string value. However, this is not the correct concept. It actually comes from the set theory. Imagine if you have two sets. One set have a value 1 and 2. The other set have values like 3 and 4. And the union type of these two sets is actually 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not either 1 and 2 or 3 and 4, right? So same concept can be applied here. So the union type of these is actually, as long as it can contain either properties of loading state or fail state, or contain both of them, or you have like even have some other random properties, it can be considered a possible values of these union state. So back to the previous example, the reason why the compiler doesn't complain is because the empty array as a stores and true value as a loading property and the string as arrow is also one of the possible values of our union type state, which is store state. So that's why the compilers think, okay, it's a valid, legitimate state. That's why they don't complain about these. And the other example in the previous slides, you mentioned why the fetch store state doesn't have arrow properties, even if we already use union type. And the reason is not all of the possible values of this fetch store state have arrow properties. So if you try to access these properties reluctantly, the compiler will say, will give you a hint saying it's not the case. Like probably some values doesn't have the arrow properties. That's the thing you have to be aware of. So back to our original example, how can we solve these issues? We can make use of the so-called advanced type techniques in TypeScript, which is called discriminated unions. And by discriminated unions, it means for each type of your union candidates, you can provide an extra properties. In this case, I give extra state properties. And for the values of these extra properties, you need to provide a unique values of each state. Like the loading state have a loading as a string, and fail state have arrow as a string, and success state have a success as a string. With these techniques, now the compiler can infer the correct type by checking the state, the value of the state. If you want to know more about this, you can go to the TypeScript advanced type techniques documentation to see more details. And after I structure using discriminated unions techniques, now the compiler will complain correctly because now the state of this is success. And the compiler will know the fetch store state shouldn't have the arrow field because it's a success state. And here comes the next issue. I call it like I feel like handling nothing today. What does it mean? After I refactor my code using discriminated unions, now I can, based on my current state, I can render corresponding components. If it's loading, I'll render loading components. If it's error, I'll render error components. If it's success, I'll render a list of stores. However, you can comment it out. You cannot handle anything, but still compiles. The compiler will not tell you any hint saying like you forgot to handle this and that. And so if you are like, as a developers, we always forget about handling like some edge cases, right? And also some developers may just be lazy. Like I don't want to handle it today, but you can still commit this code and being released to production. And after that, the user probably will suffer bad user experience. Can we force everyone to handle all possible states? Yes, we can. We can even do it in TypeScript as well. But you have to create another funky functions, which I call it being lazy here. So this being lazy function, it take an argument, which is a never type. And the meaning of never type is as long as any values comes in, the compiler will complain saying it shouldn't have like any possible values can be passed to this as an argument. So if you structure your application using switch case this way, if you didn't handle any of the cases here, it will fall through to the default block. And once you fall through to the default block, you will pass some values to the being lazy function. And that's when your compiler will complain and give you a hint saying probably you forgot to handle certain case. And this is the result after I structure these utility functions. Now, even if I didn't handle the loading status or error status, the compiler will tell me you forgot to do something. And it all happens during build time. So you can make sure before you release, your application is in a good shape. And our last issue is, what if API doesn't respect the contract? By contract, I mean, this is the original simple response I got from Uber Eats. And originally, the image field is supposed to have another items key. An items key will hold a list of image URL. But somehow the back engineer or API developers forget to add this items key and only have a URL key. What will happen to your application? Your application will break immediately. And the reason is because when you develop your application, you trust the type definition of your code, right? And in your type definition, items field will always be there. That's why you didn't do the extra handling. However, what if the external world doesn't respect the contract? It will break your application immediately, and your user cannot do anything about this. So here I kind of summarize some issues we may have when developing with TypeScript. First of all, developers sometimes can be lazy not to handle the edge cases like error cases or loading cases. And second of all, I think what TypeScript claims is not 100% guarantee. And I think the main reason probably is because there's like some advanced type techniques is up-in features. So you can choose not to be safe all the time. And also, you can have things like any type. If you don't know how to type anything, you can give it as an any. But the consequence of doing this is the rest of your application may suffer. Probably they will receive the data with unexpected types. And the third of all, as I mentioned in the previous, it's a really simple application, but we make so many mistakes. And it's because there are so many impossible states in our application. And with TypeScript, of course, you can still eliminate those impossible states, but it's harder. You need more efforts to do it. And at the end, I think it's quite vulnerable to the external or uncertain world. For example, what if API change the contract or doesn't respect the contract? And also most of the system or websites will connect with many third-party systems as well, or API. And if they don't follow the contract, the data will be polluted into your application code as well. So finally, what Elms bring to the table? Yeah, I believe there are many Elm experts as an audience today. Probably they know more. For me, I just worked with these for 1 year, but yeah, here is my findings here. First of all, for Elm, I think it provides the better primitives for building types. What does it mean? The left side is how we use discriminated unions to build our fetch store state. And it's categorized as advanced TypeScript techniques in TypeScript documentation. However, for Elm, it's actually a pretty basic one to use these kind of techniques. It's called custom types in Elm. And if you don't use these kind of type techniques, it's harder to let you do anything, basically. So that's why I call it a primitive. Like, it's not really like primitives in the programming language sense, but I feel like it's basic building blocks in Elm. So when you develop using Elm, you have to use it. And for TypeScript, it's an opt-in feature. You can choose to use it or choose not to. And this makes the whole difference. And second of all, I think Elm set a clear boundary between safe and unsafe area. I got this image from Luca, and Luca is one of the audience today as well. Probably he can share some thoughts later. And basically, by unsafe area, it means like external world or API. It's like something you cannot control. And safe area is your Elm application. So when you receive some data comes to your safe area, it must go through the Elm runtime first. And the Elm runtime will ensure the external world will respect the contract, will follow the type definition you define. And that's why when it goes to the safe area, you can 100% guarantee the type definition is correct. That's also the reason why Elm claims there's no runtime error. And here is one of the mechanism, one of the example mechanism inside the Elm runtime. So you can implement your own decoders. It's called JSON decoder. It's actually an easy concept. It's basically like JSON schema. When the API response comes to your application, first of all, it will go through this data pipeline to check if each field, for example, the UID exists or not, and the type is integer. And the next one is title if it's string, and does it exist? If it's not, it will stop your application here. And at the H part of your application, it won't pass through to the Elm part and the rest of your application. And also, when you receive any error, you have to handle it. I will talk about more about this later. So to summarize, I think in the past, backend engineers always say we should never trust a client. But I think we have all the rights to say, as a front-end engineer, we should never trust any external world, because we can use this kind of like decoder mechanism to make sure all the contracts being enforced. And what if it's not being respected, as the previous example shows? This time, if you develop using Elm, your page won't crash anymore. And here you can provide an empty state or a nice looking arrow state with some action buttons to your users. And in the previous example, it's a like invertible state, like where the user cannot do anything without continue. And also, if something goes wrong, if you work with the dev mode, you can check the Elm debugger. Because of those decoder, you can get a really clear error messages. For example, it says, in my previous example, it says, expecting an object with a field name items. So it's pretty clear, right? You can like bring this tag to your back engineer, say, hey, my compiler say the response doesn't have a field name items, and you have to fix it. And the next characteristic, I think it's, I call it limiting the possibilities of each type. If you still remember my previous example, when we fetch the API, why the compiler didn't tell me much information? And even if I'm making some stupid mistakes. And I think one of the reason is if you check the response type, it's actually an object type. And for this object type, it doesn't really tell you the relationship between each field. And also, it can have infinite possibilities, like, because for example, you have like different status code, and sometimes this response may be an error response, sometimes it will be a successful response. But the relationship between those possibilities is not well stated using this type structure. However, with Elm, there is the default return type of the API client is called result type. For result type, there are only two possibilities. One is OK, comes along with a value. The other one is arrow type, comes along with an arrow structure. And only two possibilities. That's why your compiler can know if you already handle all cases or not. And yeah, here is this point again. The Elm compiler can force you to handle all possible cases. If you still remember this example, in Typescript, if you want to check, make sure all the state is being handled, we have to make this funky function, which is called being lazy, and using type as never as an argument. And in Elm, it comes out of box, because as I mentioned before, the compiler knows all the possibilities of this state. That's why if you didn't handle any of them, for example, in this example, I just comment out the error cases, and you will receive the clear error message right away. And the error messages look really nice. It says the case doesn't have branches of all possibilities, and even pointing out what's the missing possibilities. In here, it says it's an error cases you didn't handle. So same on the UI part. For the UI, if you didn't handle any of your UI application state, here I commented out the error state. And the compiler will tell you the case doesn't have branches of all possibilities. And the missing possibilities is the error cases. And I think it's a superpower. But in TypeScript, you need to be a pro to master those superpower. But with Elm, it's like basic stuff. Like the compiler will teach you how to do things right. And with all those being said, I haven't even talked about any terms of functional programming like functor monad or like blah, 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 like many some complicated stuffs. And I think that's also one of the reasons what makes Elm more approachable, because you don't feel like those concepts being too complicated to prevent you from being productive. With Elm, you can start writing a website right away. So I believe you will have fun developing it, because that's why I did in the past 1 year. And as a conclusion, first of all, I think with Elm, you don't have to be smart to write safe code. I always think functional programming is for stupid people like me to learn, because you don't have to be an expert to write server code. The compiler will teach you all the time. And the second one is even strong type language can be not type safe. Even if you're using strong type language, as long as type definition is not 100% guaranteed, you may get a false sense of safety. For example, in Java, you always receive like null pointer exception. And with TypeScript, because of the existence of any, and something can still go wrong. So even if you're working with strong type language, try to explore those advanced type techniques to protect what you want to protect. And at the end, I think we can be smarter by transplanting good paradigms from Elm to TypeScript or other language to the language you are working as a daily job. And let me take the TypeScript as an example. I think it's harder to master advanced TypeScript techniques by only writing TypeScript itself, because most of those advanced features are up-in feature. So you can always choose not to be safe. However, by working directly with Elm, those advanced type techniques in TypeScript are considered as basic techniques in Elm, and you have to use it to make things work. And that's how you can learn those techniques in a more efficient way and bring back to write better TypeScript. And with that being said, I think that's it about my talk. Thank you for your listening. If you have any questions, and that's the time.
Yeah, thanks, Paipo, for this great introduction to it. And it's really nice to see the comparison of TypeScript and by the side, the left side and the right-hand side. So if anyone has any question, please ask or type in the chat. Both ways are fine.
Is there any suggestion for like existing TypeScript applications? Like how can we convert it to Elm?
Okay, so I mean, probably Luca will have different answers, but for me, I think I would suggest you not to do so. Although I know like some people from Elm community will suggest you can start with like some small part of like for example business logic heavy place to rewrite it and then kind of plugging into your existing TypeScript code. But I would say first of all it's hard to maintain, and because I have this experience in the company as well. So I would suggest the best way is if you have like some internal tools in the companies, and you can like start clean with Elm directly without migrating with any other existing website or applications. Does it answer your questions?
Yes, thank you. So does Elm integrate with React?
Yeah, you can. There's a library called Elm React. You can only use Elm to write the logic itself, business logic itself, and that the React do the rendering. But Elm itself already comes along with it's called the Elm architecture T. Yeah, and it basically the same structure like Redux. It's a single what's it called? Single data flow, single data binding, things like that. And you have a global store, have an action, and have a view. So the structure is pretty similar. And with Elm, you don't need to introduce like extra libraries like Redux. You can just use this Elm architecture out of the box. For these questions, like Luca, do you have other suggestions like integrating with existing, like for example, TypeScript project?
Yeah, so, oh, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
As you said, the community, yeah, it's suggestion to do it gradually. So if you want to introduce Elm in your company, they suggest you to maybe start replacing a small part of a larger project. So that other developers can be more confident that it's just an attempt, and you can always reverse back and remove it if something goes wrong. There were also been discussion in the past about having some tool that would automatically convert a React application into an M application, but and I was always skeptic about those, and I think nobody ever made one actually. And yeah, and about integrating, I mean, the possibility of existing together. Yeah, I mean, probably again, if I introduce in Elm into an existing project. If there is a possibility, maybe you just convert a small widget. Maybe you give just a little part of the DOM, and you say, please Elm control this part, and everything else you leave it to be controlled by by React. Of course, there is a problem. Both of them use a virtual DOM, so you have to be careful about sharing DOM part because you don't want to create conflict. So. But yeah, this is usually what the community suggests.
Thank you very much.
So, any other question? I think TypeScript is a really common like technology now. So if they can integrate easier, it will be helpful for most developers. But since they have different goals, actually, TypeScript at its beginning says they want to be as much compatible to JavaScript as possible. So it's somehow even TypeScript code can become difficult to guarantee it's correct, like use too many any. But on the other hand, M sometimes too strict. Sometimes I just want to write a very simple component, and I found I need to write the whole module command view, and I need to put the state in somewhere that's very strict. So even I wrote it with great pleasure, but sometimes I feel annoying. So I think maybe this is a difficult issue. So yeah. We have if we have more questions, please just ask now, and you can also send in message chat or anything you want to ask or want to discuss. So we are actually in free discussion time now. Yeah.
Hello. So thank you for sharing. I think I have a question about. Would like to know what is the successful story when the company pushing Elm or this kind of like gradually successful maybe within the team.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. And yeah, first of all, I would like to I provide some slides about this. Actually, in Mercari, we do have some projects using Elm, and Greg is one of the maintainer, and I'm also the other maintainer. And in my case, I use Elm to develop. Can you guys still see my slides?
Yeah, but it's in the preview or the editing mode. Yeah, I think in present mode is better.
Okay, so in my case, I use Elm to develop internal tools. And this tool has only less than 10 internal users. And the UI design for this tool or the deadline is not that strict. It's not, and also it's not a customer facing website. So that's why I choose to use Elm. And right now, this one is on production. Although it's still a small project, so if you're asking about like more scalable or big projects, I think Luca probably will be the right person to answer it because he has all the knowledge about how to introduce to companies and do a workshop to educate other developers as well.
Yeah, I would like to know for a bigger team, maybe like 3-4 people working with the same team, and maybe how's the learning curve, how everyone getting comfortable to adopt is like, what's the transition, like the point, like people can get into this. I think, maybe it's challenging question.
Yeah, well, yeah, like my personal experience is still with a small team, though not that large team, and we try. So I'm working in Rakuten, and so we tried. I tried first to introduce, but I never try actually gradually in an existing project. Actually, I always been against this advice. Maybe it was that was the problem, because the first time I tried to introduce it was a failure. Because eventually the CTO was against it, and they didn't work out. The second time, I was in a situation where actually I was working with Greg, and then there was other architects who were very much into functional programming. So at that point, it was easier, and we were lucky that we just started a new project. And I started making a proof of concept using Elm. And then it became a reality, so it's now in production. It's the login and registration system of Rakuten. Probably a successful story, but the most famous one is, of course, the one at Node-RED Inc. That is this American company that built a tool for educators. And they had a React application, and they did the gradual stuff. They started a small thing. and then other engineer like it, and they also, they have this tool where they were tracking errors in production in the browser, and of course the Elm part, it doesn't really have error at runtime. So they got convinced, and then they gradually shift completely the entire application. I think at this point, I think it's almost 100% Elm, and then they also shifted the backend, and now they're using Haskell. But I mean, yeah, this is a successful story, but those are people who then really buy into the idea of functional programming. That is not always simple.
I think what Paipo just coming in the slide, the last one, which says that there is no too many functional ideas you need to force yourself to learn about it. It somehow make M easier than start from other things. But it's actually smuggle some ideas. You just don't know that actually is similar to other more powerful language. Like you have pipeline. You can use pipeline as a Monet if you want, but you will not code as a Monet because it will scare people out. So I think that's also another thing if you want to start any project in a company and to build your team. It's actually advanced. Yeah, just some comments from my side.
Okay, thank you.
May I have one more question? In your experience building Elm applications, do you notice any restrictions, especially in web applications? Like, for example, how does Elm working with universal JavaScript applications, or does Elm integrate it with, for example, different backend systems? Well, like Java or Django, like Python backend, just for example, like if you're running your backend web application and it renders in JSP, how does it integrate with Elm? Like in general, what kind of restriction should I expect?
Okay. So to answer these questions, I actually prepare another slide as well. Here, I talk about some downside. And so first of all, you mentioned about server-side rendering, right? As far as I know, now Elm doesn't support server-side rendering out of box. And if you want to use it, probably you have to do it on your own. And the second point is Elm can be transpiled to JavaScript. So as long as the place where you can run JavaScript, you can work along with Elm as well. And some other restriction probably will be if you want to use some web API, which is not implemented in Elm yet, you probably need to communicate. You have to use technical port. You have to communicate with the JavaScript side and use the JavaScript side to call the web API and then communicate back to the Elm application. And for me, I think it's a restriction because it's not that trivial, because there are so many web APIs out there. If you want to implement features, definitely need the web API. I think it's not that easy to be done. And for other downside, I think performance-wise, it's there's a benchmark. It looks like Elm can perform even better than React, but it for the I know there's a benchmark on the lines of code when you implement an application using different languages, and Elm have much more code lines than other framework. And another part, originally I said the outdated documentations, but it seems when I start using Elm, when I find online, there's many documentation about 0.18, but at the moment I was working on Elm is 0.19, so that's why I said outdated documentation. I think now probably it's getting better. And the third one is about the smaller ecosystem. For example, if you want to create, let's say a day picker, although you have the Elm day picker or other components, but there's not too much options out there. And if some UIs or some utilities libraries is not being implemented yet, you probably have to implement on your own. I think that's one of the restriction. Or another alternatives, you can use the npm, use the JavaScript libraries, and then using port again to communicate with the Elm. So yeah, did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. That's pretty sufficient.
Oh, we have one raised hand.
Yeah. So I think I read a little bit Elm before, but because I'm not very experienced in Elm, I think the main struggles I have is it makes me very difficult to estimate when can I implement some of the features, because when I use like React or some other libraries, I'm pretty sure no matter what features I need, there's tools already in the community. But when I'm using Elm for a small project or small features might be fine. But if it's a kind of long-term stuff, then I will feel it's difficult for me to estimate how many weeks or months I can implement projects. So if I have to work with other colleagues, it will make the whole estimation more difficult. I think that's the problem I meet. So I'm kind of curious to know how do you overcome this in the beginning, because it feels like you need to have a very experienced Elm developer in the team. You need to have at least one, right? So he can take the final responsibility if you need to estimate the schedule or something.
Yeah, so for your questions, first of all, I totally agree with you. I only worked with them for like 1 year, and at the beginning, the productivity is really low. And but I personally think it's a matter of time. Although after 1 year, I'm still not confident enough to say I can be really productive as fast as React, but it's getting better. And second of all, it's about the estimation on the project itself. I think that's why I choose the internal tools to be the project I'm working in the companies, because I also think it's definitely a things you have to take into consideration, because no matter the ecosystem or the documentation out there is not that, I think it's not that mature. So when you estimate the task, it's definitely harder. So I would suggest you choose like some low risk project to start with.
I can have additional comments. Is actually it depends on how many times you can spend on debugging. Debugging issues like null is not a function, or on device not a function. Sometimes it's not easy as writing M. And debugging a bug that only appears on the production build, and when user click a button in very edge case, is also not easy. So this in my project, because I only have very few people at very strict timeline a lot of time. So I choose to use N for this trade-off. I don't have time for debug and writing test. Especially I don't have time for writing test for like every edge case. I want a compiler to help me. I mean, if React can build React or TypeScript can provide the same compiler technology can help me to detect each case and every branch I missed, I will more than happy to use it. But unfortunately, this world is split. One is React with a lot of support, but you have dynamic language runtime every box and the TypeScript problem. And another side is M with fewer support. And sometimes you got out-of-date package, but compiler will help you with a lot of things. So I think it's about trade-off to me. Yeah. So whether we have other questions or feedback or want to discuss something? Okay, we have one by Neil.
Hi. Thank you for the great talk. It's pretty inspiring. And I have one question. If we, let's say, other team decide to transfer an existing project to use Elm, do you have any takeaway or suggestion to make the transition to Elm more smooth or more fluently?
Yeah, to be honest, I didn't have experience to transfer an existing project to Helm. So the one I'm working on is start from scratch. How about you, Greg or Luca? Do you guys have this experience to migrate from a project with other languages to Elm?
No, non-existing project. I don't know. I think, as I mentioned also earlier, it's if you have a team that is profi. I mean, nowadays, if someone asks me, please convert this project of React, I would just do it. I mean, because you know, again, when you get familiarity, I guess now if you ask me to do something, I will be probably faster in Elm than in JavaScript or in React. And I was listening to a talk of Richard Friedman that he says, you know, when React came out, he would say, yeah, this is kind of nice, but if I have to write something very quick, I would use jQuery, because, you know, at that time everybody was very familiar with jQuery, so that was the fastest things to do. And so I think there is a lot about familiarity. So if you have a team that is familiar with Elm, I think the easiest way, the smoothest way is just you copy it and you just build it in Elm. If you don't have a team where nobody is very proficient in Elm, then there is a very nice Elm community that can support. So you can ask there, and then again, maybe better to start with something that is not risky, because probably, well, first of all, estimation is basically impossible in our field, I guess, with any technology, even if you are familiar. But if you are not familiar, estimating is close to just give a random number. So just be sure that it's okay, you know, to delay the project, that you don't have a strict deadline, and then you just try with the help of the community.
So I think it's a similar question, like if I want to migrate the current code base to Flutter or Angular from React, maybe we will face the same problem. But I think a dynamic language or a less weaker compiler gives you some freedom. Sometimes bring more problem after your migration. But at the beginning, you don't pay for the learning curve. That's somehow attractive. So that's maybe it's easier to imagine to migrate it to other similar technology instead of migrate to N.
I actually have. Oh, one more question.
Fine.
Go ahead.
Sorry, after your answer, sorry.
Oh, I just want to mention that I actually have experience migrating Elm back to React and TypeScript, and I wouldn't say it's hard. I mean, it's quite easy actually, because you already have a well-defined types out there, and you just need to transfer back to TypeScript. And you can also write better TypeScript with this way, because you already have those advanced type techniques using Elm. So that's the experience I'm having right now.
Yeah. Oh, this is interesting. So this is where this presentation is coming from.
Okay, so the problem is, I have to tell you guys the problem. This project is a successful project. It's released to production and it's working. However, I try to give some internal talks and to ask more people to buy in, and it's harder. And now I'm leaving the current company. I'm like changing my job, and we start have a discussion talking about who should maintain this project. Although we have some people who like join this project and have some developments, but probably they don't have enough experience to, or confidence to maintain this project. And that's the decision we have to make. Like, are we still going with Elm, or should we rewrite? At the end, we go for rewrite. But it turns out it's not that difficult. It's quite easy to migrate from the existing Elm application to React and TypeScript tech stack.
So Ifan.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just forgot to say that thank you for this great sharing. And sorry that my question might sound a bit discouraging, but actually I don't want to write TypeScript in the middle of your talk. Like, yeah, it's pretty cumbersome. So I'm just wondering that, is there any like starter kit or like any boilerplate that we can start to use building Elm applications that you find it good or like you have good experience with?
If you want to start, you can try with this repository. I just posted in the chat. It's called Create Elm App. So
Yeah.
with this, yeah. Go ahead.
No, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. I thought you finished.
I just want to mention, unlike Create React app, once you eject the Create React app, you will have like tons of files or code. And I think Create Elm app basically just did the basic setting for you. And it's also because this ecosystem is only have Elm inside. It's not having like WebHack, Paipo, or like all of the ecosystem chain out there. So that's why I think that's the reason why it makes it easier. How about you, Dukat? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. There is also Elm-Spa that nowadays is quite popular. So if you need to build a single page application, that is it's a nice way to bootstrap an application.
Thank you very much. I forgot to ask one thing. So how is Elm like working in Chrome DevTool? Like, is it easy to debug?
I think you have like end life or I don't know. They have a time machine, which is pretty nice, but they deprecate some part of the features. And usually I debug with end life. It's pretty enough. You don't need to debug from a browser console directly. You debug from the code, and the compiler will automatically reflect the change to the Chrome.
Yeah. So for these questions, first of all, I think you seldom need to debug the runtime Elm application because the compiler will catch most of the error cases. And that's why it says once it compiles, it definitely works. And the other point is, I think Elm doesn't come along with a source map, which means when you debug on the runtime, I think it's also not that easy, but it seldom happens. That's from my previous experience.
Yeah, because the most valuable part is the compiler, so every change it need to be passed through a compiler. So you usually don't need to do reverse engineer from the JavaScript to M code actually.
Yeah, I never done it actually.
And for a development environment, it comes along with Debugger. I probably put it. It's called this one, and this will come out of box because in Elm architecture, basically it's like Redux. You have many action or messages flowing around, and in Elm, by checking the orders of doing the time travel of each messages, you can probably reproduce the box itself, or you can check the error messages inside this Elm debugger as well.
Thank you very much.
So we still have time. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question. So, what do you think it's some feature that Elm is missing, or you would like to see in Elm?
I think for me, I think I definitely hope if, for example, I need some package or API, it can be already implemented in Elm, and I can find it directly in their official website. But it's not always the case, right? So if I'm working on a like time-sensitive project, it will make me stressful. Like I probably will think I need to implement JavaScript and use import, things like that. And it also probably because I'm not that familiar or comfortable developing in Elm yet. So that's why I hope, I definitely hope in more like web API or some other tools, components can be implemented in native Elm.
I think one thing I can add is recently there are some packages that really outdated or beyond using some packages that have the security concerns, but the packaging maintenance are things not really maintained. So when you have the security scan, it's always show that there are some security issue, although they are almost all developer tools. I think it's kind of a community problem or marketing problem, development marketing, because even Node.js has lot of like packages out there or with security concern cannot be fixed. But that's a recent issues I encountered because our company start to audit the packages, so this really become a problem. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, actually for this problem in particular, I eventually clone a few libraries because I need to remove those security issues. So if your problem is with Elm Live, you can use Elm Go. That's how I clone. Okay, yeah, thank you. That was an interesting thing because people are always asking me, what is that you would like to see in Elm, and it's yeah, I always am not sure what to answer to that question.
Okay, so Paipo, do you have any like things try to ask audience or thing to?
I think I probably, yeah, I pretty much say everything. So that's it on my side.
Yeah. And I think we will like to thank Lucas, our actually third speaker. Yeah. And if there is no other question, I think we can end this meetup. Any other feedback, opinion, discussion? If no, we will like to close the meetup earlier. Okay. It's really nice to see you all online. And by the way, we have a Google Speaker for the station. And please remember to check what WebHack events on campus and get the registration. So thank you very much, and see you next time. And bye bye.